In the summer of 1999, the cultural landscape of television and film was already beginning to change. Animated shows were no longer dismissed as children's entertainment but were instead pushing their way into adult satire, exploring themes of politics, culture, and morality with an edge that live action often shied away from. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. At the center of this shift were two audacious creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone. With their irreverent series South Park, which debuted in 1997 on Comedy Central, they had already demonstrated a willingness to skewer every sacred cow in sight. But when they made the leap to the silver screen with South Park, bigger, longer and uncut, the duo transformed from TV provocateurs into full-fledged cultural disruptors. The movie was crude, yes, but beneath the wall of profanity was a biting critique of censorship, moral panic, and the tendency of societies to scapegoat others for their own problems. The film followed the misadventures of four familiar boys from the fictional town of South Park: Stan Marsh, Kyle Broflovsky, Eric Cartman, and the perpetually doomed Kenny McCormick. Their antics began innocently enough, sneaking into an R-rated film called Asses of Fire, which starred the equally crude Canadian duo Terrance and Phillip. After being inspired by their idols' gleeful embrace of profanity, the boys started swearing with abandon. What might have remained a harmless bit of youthful rebellion quickly snowballed into something much larger. Parents, alarmed at their children's new vocabulary, launched a crusade against Terrance and Phillip. Soon, this localized hysteria escalated into full-blown geopolitical madness, with the United States declaring war on Canada. It was absurd, exaggerated, and yet strangely insightful, a commentary on how small cultural flashpoints can spiral into international hostility when filtered through fear and moral outrage. Among the film's most memorable elements were its musical numbers, which functioned as both parody and social commentary. Blame Canada, in particular, became the movie's breakout moment. The song, performed with mock earnestness, channeled America's long history of projecting its anxieties outward. Instead of confronting its own failings, whether in parenting, media consumption, or culture, society, the song argued, found it easier to assign fault to an external target. In this case, that target was Canada, America's most benign and reliable ally. The brilliance of the satire was recognized even outside comedy circles. Blame Canada was nominated for Best Original Song at the 72nd Academy Awards, a rare honor for an animated comedy rooted in vulgarity. Few Canadians took offense. The humor, after all, rested on the sheer absurdity of the idea: America, a global superpower, treating its polite and cooperative northern neighbor as a mortal threat. For decades, the US and Canada had shared not just borders, but culture, trade, intelligence, and military cooperation. Their relationship was so intertwined and stable that the notion of open conflict was laughable. And yet, 2 decades later, what once seemed like parody began to feel strangely prescient. Scrolling through Instagram one recent afternoon, I stumbled upon an ad for Aviation American Gin, the brand co-owned by Ryan Reynolds. Reynolds is perhaps the most beloved Canadian in Hollywood, charming, witty, and proud of his heritage. Ordinarily, his marketing posts attract a wave of affectionate comments from fans on both sides of the border. But this time, the replies from Canadians carried an edge that was hard to ignore. While we Canadian flag emoji, all love you Ryan, not buying American. They are bullying us. We are standing up, elbows up and buying, wrote Marian's paintings. Another user, Jessica Sowers, chimed in, when Rump leaves and we can have American booze in Canada again I will get some. And then there was Ibokanada, you need to lose the American gin and make a Canadian one At first glance, these remarks seemed like light-hearted ribbing, classic Canadian humor, polite but firm. Yet underneath the jokes was something more serious: frustration, disillusionment, and even a sense of betrayal. For decades, Canadians had regarded the United States as a partner, a friend, and often, as family. But during the Trump years, that relationship was tested in ways few could have predicted. While Canadians carried on with their famously understated way of life, minding their own business, as they like to say, Donald Trump began reshaping the US-Canada relationship in ways that rattled Ottawa and ordinary citizens alike. The first signs were brushed off as humor in poor taste. At a private dinner at Mar-a-Lago in November, while still president-elect, Trump reportedly joked to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau about annexing Canada. Canadian officials rolled their eyes and laughed it away. America's leaders had made off-color remarks before, and no one seriously thought it was more than bluster. But Trump didn't let the joke go. He repeated it at rallies. He repeated it in interviews. And as time went on, his delivery shifted. What had once been couched as humor now came across as increasingly sincere. By January, Trump was telling reporters he might use economic force to acquire Canada, language that went beyond satire into the realm of geopolitical provocation. The situation escalated in February during a phone call with Trudeau. Trump bluntly told the Canadian leader that he did not recognize the 1908 treaty that had defined the US-Canada border for over a century. He floated the idea of revisiting or redrawing boundaries, a suggestion that alarmed diplomats and analysts alike. The world's longest undefended border, once a symbol of peace and cooperation, was suddenly being called into question by the most powerful officeholder in the United States. Behind the scenes, things grew darker still. Reports emerged that Trump's administration was exploring the possibility of excluding Canada from the Five Eyes, the intelligence-sharing alliance that had been the cornerstone of Western security cooperation since the Cold War. To be cut out of such an alliance would have been not only a humiliation for Canada but also a seismic rupture in North America's security architecture. Meanwhile, Trump's public rhetoric turned openly hostile. He referred to Canada dismissively as the 51st state, reducing its sovereignty to a mere extension of American will. He called Justin Trudeau the governor, stripping him of the respect typically afforded to a democratically elected leader. He even began hinting at tearing up the Great Lakes agreements, which govern shared waterways critical to both nations' environmental and economic well-being. Military cooperation, a bedrock of the alliance since World War II, was suddenly cast into doubt. Trump questioned whether joint defense operations were still worthwhile, leaving Canadian defense officials scrambling to assess the implications. For Canadians, it was bewildering. For generations, they had stood beside Americans in wars, in diplomacy, in trade negotiations, and in cultural exchange. They had seen themselves not merely as neighbors but as partners. The idea that their closest ally would suddenly treat them with hostility, or worse, as a conquest, was alien, even surreal. In the end, what Trey Parker and Matt Stone had envisioned in 1999 as an outlandish satire, a world where America turned on Canada, no longer seemed so far-fetched. The absurdity had become plausible, the joke had curdled into reality, and Canadians were left wondering what had happened to the special relationship they once trusted so deeply. When South Park, Bigger, Longer and Uncut premiered in 1999, it was dismissed by some critics as little more than a foul-mouthed cartoon stretched to feature length. Yet, beneath its barrage of profanity and absurdity lay an incisive critique of American society and its reflexive tendencies. Trey Parker and Matt Stone didn't just lampoon parental hysteria over profanity, they dismantled the larger cultural impulse to look outward for enemies when the real problems lay within. That was the brilliance of Blame Canada. It was outrageous, catchy, and unforgettable, but it was also a mirror. The humor landed precisely because of the unshakable foundation of US-Canada friendship. For generations, the two nations had cultivated a relationship so stable that the idea of conflict seemed not only far-fetched but outright impossible. Shared values, economic interdependence, and military partnerships had forged a bond unlike any other in the world. Canada was more than a neighbor, it was family. But satire has a way of foreshadowing uncomfortable truths. What once felt like comedy began, 2 decades later, to resemble a cautionary tale. Consider how North America looked at the dawn of the 21st century. The US and Canada were deeply integrated, from trade deals like NAFTA to cross-border cooperation on security, health, and environmental issues. Millions of Canadians worked, studied, and vacationed in the US, just as millions of Americans made their way north each year. Pop culture flowed seamlessly across the border. Canadians filled American movie screens and sports rosters, while American television, fashion, and technology dominated Canadian households. The assumption was that this relationship was unshakable. And yet, political winds can shift quickly, particularly when nationalism takes root. When Donald Trump entered the political arena, he brought with him a philosophy rooted in transactional relationships and a rhetoric that thrived on disruption. Allies were not partners in his worldview, They were either assets to be leveraged or obstacles to be bulldozed. For most Americans, this philosophy was aimed at Europe, China, or Mexico. But for Canadians, watching